So, shall we start, dear colleagues? Yes. Can we start? Yes. So, my name is Natalia Shlichta. I'm the head of the history department here at Kyiv-Mogilянській Academy, and it's my true honor, privilege, and great pleasure to welcome you all at this public event organized by the International Renaissance Foundation and National University of Kyiv-Mogilянській Academy. And the event is a public lecture by Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш, who I'm very pleased to welcome here at Kyiv-Mogilянській Academy. It's not the first time when Professor is here. He'll deliver the lecture today, but he did this during something like 20 years ago during the Orange Revolution. So it's his comeback to Kyiv-Mogilянській Academy, and we hope this is a good tradition and he'll be back again after the victory in this ongoing war. So Professor Tімоті Ґартон Еш is a person who needs no introduction, but I'll still briefly introduce him. So he's a prominent British historian, author, and commentator. He is a professor of European Studies in the University of Oxford, Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Anthony's College at Oxford, and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He writes for New York Review of Books, and he also has a column on international affairs in The Guardian. Throughout the 1980s, he was a witness and a reporter and an analyst of the events that shook Central Europe and Europe overall after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he wrote many articles then for New York Review of Books, for Independent, The Times, and The Spectator. He is also the author of 10 books about the present history of Europe, history of present, in which he analyzes all these events that are happening in Europe, starting from the beginning of the Second World War up until today. He has won many prizes for his writings, including a very prestigious Charlemagne Prize. And his most recent book, which is entitled Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, will officially come out of print in a few weeks. And this book is a kind of a personal memoir, personal story from the rebuilding period after the Second World War up until these days of the ongoing war started by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. So, and we'll have an opportunity to listen to Professor Ґартон Еш's lecture, and we'll have an opportunity to ask him questions and maybe share some thoughts about his vision of European history. So I'll tell you briefly how we'll work today. So we'll start with a brief public lecture by Professor, and the title, I'll tell you the title, From Post-War Europe to Post-War Europe and Back, Russia's War Against Ukraine in the Context of Post-1945 and Post-1989 European History. I'll ask Professor to limit himself to 30 up to 40 minutes, if you may, yeah? So something up to 40 minutes lecture, and afterwards we'll have a Q&A section. We'll already collected many of your questions that you left during the registration, and if I have an opportunity, I'll ask some of them. But I urge you to ask questions yourself and questions about the lecture, about the book, or generally about professors' view of European history, and also to share your own thoughts about the issues raised by Professor in his lecture. So thank you so much for coming. It's my real pleasure to give word to you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Boris Johnson is not particularly popular with us in Britain because he took us out of the EU, but I know he's very popular here. Listen, it's a great pleasure to be back at the Kievo-Mogilянській Academy. As you mentioned, I had the great delight of giving a lecture here during the Orange Revolution 20 years ago, which was a moment of great optimism. And let me also say that I'm here also as a gesture of solidarity with you in Ukraine during this war. What I'm going to do in the next 35 to 40 minutes is, first of all, to share very briefly with you the bare bones of an interpretation of recent European history, which I offer in my new book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, and then to go into the conversation with you by making a few remarks about Ukraine and the current war in this context. From post-war Europe to post-wall Europe, i.e. the Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and back. My book is in conversation with a book many of you will know by a wonderful historian called Tony Judd, a book called Post-War. How many of you, hands up, who knows this book by Tony Judd? One or two people here. I recommend it very strongly. It's a history of Europe from 1945 until about 2005. And this title, Post-War, has two meanings. An obvious one and a less obvious one. The obvious one is after the war, i.e. after 1945, right? That's what we call post-war. The less obvious meaning is after war. That is to say, it's a story of a Europe which, after 1945, set out to put an end to war in Europe forever. Never again was the slogan of Europe in 1945. We were going to banish that long millennial history of European wars. Now, the idea that Europeans actually abhorred and abjured war would have been very surprising news to people all over the world, in Kenya, or in Malaysia, or in Vietnam, or in Algeria, or in Angola or Mozambique, where West European colonial powers, like Britain and France and Portugal, actually fought quite brutal colonial wars for 30 years after 1945 to try and defend their colonies. The notion that Europe was a continent without war would also have been very surprising news to people in Central and Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. Because in this part of Europe, you went on having wars. There were military conflicts in Eastern Europe throughout the late 1940s. Then you had the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, of Czechoslovakia in 1968, what was called stan wojenny in Poland, literally a state of war in Poland, 1980-81. So actually, it was only after the war came down that Europe entered, or thought it had entered, into a post-war period in a fuller sense. I remember walking down a street in Berlin 2 days after the Berlin Wall came down. And a very excited East Berliner came up to me and said he'd just seen a poster, a handwritten poster, which said, "Only today is the war really over." Right? And in a deep sense, that was true. Only today was the war really over for East Europeans. But what then happened was not only that in an objective geopolitical sense, we moved into a period of European peace. We actually had the peace settlement, which we had not had in 1945, in treaty form in 1980, 1991, but subjectively, people believed that we were moving into an area of deeper peace. We took the peace dividend, we reduced our defense spending well below the NATO target of 2% of GDP. We had slogans like Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen, the German slogan which means create peace without weapons. Security was to be achieved by non-military means, collective security. What really mattered was economic policy. Economic interdependence was thought to actually reinforce peace. So, for example, getting more and more energy from Russia was thought to be a good thing, not only because it was cheap energy, but also it was thought to reinforce the peace. And in general, West Europeans in particular thought we were moving towards Immanuel Kant's famous ideal of perpetual peace. And people forgot the old Russian proverb, perpetual peace lasts until the next war. Now, I want to argue that what underlay this was what I'm going to call a historiosophical mistake. Historiosophy, the philosophy of history. And it was to take what happened in 1989 to 1991 and to think that that was the way history was going and was going to go on going. To extrapolate forward. In other words, to take history with a small h, the product of chance, contingency, individual choice, leadership, what in Ukrainian you call volya, individual will, and to turn it into history with a capital H, in the Hegelian sense, of a process, a dialectic of the inevitable progress towards greater freedom. Whereas, in fact, what happened between 1989 and 1991, what took us into the post-war period, was a 1 in a million example of historical luck. It was an extraordinary confluence of a series of quite separate developments, each of which had nothing inevitable about it. Let me mention quickly 4. Number 1, the emergence of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev on the 11th of March 1985 as Soviet leader. A quite credible alternative candidate was called Grigory Romanov. If Grigory Romanov had become Soviet leader, the history of Europe would have been entirely different. Secondly, the fact that in East Central Europe, in countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, you had leaders like Václav Havel, Bronisław Geremek, Adam Michnik, and others who developed their own strategy for turning communism back into democracy. And so when Gorbachev gave up what was only an amber light, a yellow light, it wasn't a green light, they drove straight through the amber light and went all the way to democracy. In Western Europe, you had another extraordinary individual, Jacques Delors, president of the European Commission from 1985 onwards, who generated an extraordinary dynamism in the project of the European single market to be realized in 1992, so that at this moment, Western Europe had overwhelming appeal to people in Central and Eastern Europe. When people said, I want to be a normal country, they meant a country like West Germany or France or Britain. And finally, in the United States, which had been really in a bad way in the 1970s, after Vietnam, after Watergate, you had 2 periods of Ronald Reagan, with his great slogan, "It's morning again in America," "It's morning in America," a period of great economic dynamism. The internet was just being invented in Silicon Valley in these years. And Reagan personally did this extraordinary switch. In his first term, he was the ultimate Cold Warrior. He outarmed the Soviet Union. He showed the Soviet Union they couldn't outarm the United States. A policy of strength. But then when Gorbachev comes to power, he flips 180 degrees and becomes the ultimate apostle of détente, and actually advocates very large level détente with the Soviet Union. It was the confluence of these four quite separate developments, each of them characterized by contingency and the role of exceptional individuals. In the Soviet Union, in Central Europe, in Western Europe, in the United States, which alone made possible the changes in 1989. And then, as the years went by, we took this extraordinary piece of what Machiavelli called fortuna, historical luck, and said that's the way history is going to go, and turned what was a struggle into a sense of process. Now, some of you in this audience will be saying Francis Fukuyama. How many of you read Fukuyama? Hands up. How many of you heard of Fukuyama? Everybody, there you are. The end of history, the famous thesis of 1990. Actually, we weren't over-optimistic then. The few of you in this room who were around at that time will remember that we had no idea if this unprecedented transition from communism to democracy, from communism to capitalism, could succeed. It had never been done before. The joke at the time was, we know you can turn an aquarium into fish soup, but can you turn fish soup back into an aquarium? So we had no idea. We were totally uncertain. The transition to democracy, getting into the European Union, you know, early 1990s, many people thought that was going to take many decades. That may sound familiar to you. In fact, all the great achievements that you now associate with the European Union, the single market, freedom of movement, the Schengen area, the Eurozone, the enlargement of the European Union, so it's now your neighbors, Poland, which is in, and the Baltic states, and Romania. All of that comes 15 years later. And we had no idea if it was going to happen. And at the same time, we had 5 wars in former Yugoslavia. Let's remember that. We had wars throughout the 1990s. So we were not overconfident in the 1990s. We didn't know if we could do it. The hubris sets in, the overweening self-confidence, the historiographical mistake, in my view, in the early to mid-2000s. That is the moment at which we think everything is going so well. We've done the single market. The euro seems to be working well. We're going to have a European constitution. Remember that? A constitutional treaty. The eastward enlargement, 2004, 2007. Britain seemed at home in the European Union under Tony Blair. Remember that? And to cap it all, we had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. I have never forgotten standing on the Maidan and seeing a sea of European flags, December 2004. I've also never forgotten how cold it was, but that's by the by. It was an amazing, inspiring sight. And that fed into a narrative of constant progress towards freedom, towards democracy, towards peace, towards Europe. Whereas actually, this was precisely the moment at which European history started to turn the other way, downwards. France and the Netherlands vote down the proposed European Constitution in 2005. As you know, the Orange Revolution doesn't turn out as well as was hoped. But then, crucially, in 2007, Vladimir Putin declares war on the West at the Munich Security Conference in a famous speech. And then 2008, you have, again, 2 separate simultaneous developments. On the one hand, the global financial crisis, and on the other hand, Georgia. Russia's seizure of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And whereas in the 1980s you have these separate developments which are mutually reinforcing for the good in a positive sense, what we get from 2008 onwards is a set of separate developments which are mutually reinforcing in a negative sense. So that I talk about the upward turn in European history from the mid-1980s through 1989, and a downward turn which starts around 2005 and then really begins to hit from 2008, 2009 onwards. At this point, just quickly, one or two people in the room might say, what about 9/11? Right? Remember that? 9/11? How many of you were alive in 9/11? Hands up. One or two. I see one or two. Right. So at the time, we all thought 9/11 was going to be a turning point in world history. It was a defining moment. That was the end of the period that had begun in 1989. Interestingly enough, you know, events like buildings always look bigger the closer you are to them, or like mountains. And you actually have to take a bit of time to step back and see how big they actually are. And actually, in my view, in European history, 9/11, 2001, doesn't turn out, in hindsight, to be a real turning point. It is, I argue, 2005 to 2008. It's a turning point in the US history. It launches the US on a quite different trajectory through the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and what Richard Haas has called a decade of strategic distraction, but not, I think, for Europe. And then it goes on. The global financial crisis segues both into what's been called the Great Recession in the Western capitalist economies, and into the crisis of the Eurozone, which really starts in 2010, but continues on and off for many years. There's another big crisis in 2015. Viktor Orban in Hungary, heard of him? Viktor Orban actually starts demolishing democracy in Hungary in 2010. So we believe, and I was guilty of this too, that with the arrival of countries like Hungary and Poland into the European Union, they had become consolidated democracies. Actually, Viktor Orban has succeeded in demolishing democracy in Hungary, not just in spite of the European Union, but with the help of funds from the European Union. Those billions of EU funds have been used by his regime actually to erode democracy. Then, of course, as you all know, you have 2014, the seizure of Crimea, and the beginning of the war in the Donbass. 2015, the election of the Law and Justice parties, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość in Poland, means that in your Western neighbor Poland, you have a party in power and a president who are trying to emulate Viktor Orban. Orbanizacja la Polonaise is the program of peace. They haven't got as far as Hungary because the forces of resistance are stronger, but nonetheless, a further negative development. 2015, 2016, the refugee crisis. So at that point, people start building walls again instead of demolishing them, starting with Viktor Orban, who builds a new wall, actually a fence, on the frontier between Hungary and Serbia. And from then on, we're building walls in Europe, not knocking them down, now between Poland and Belarus, between Lithuania and Belarus. So now we have a Europe which has both walls and war in eastern Ukraine. Then we have Brexit, 2016. Boris Johnson to thank for that, amongst others. The election of Donald Trump, COVID, and then, of course, I don't need to tell you, on the 24th of February, 2022, the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945, which has now gone on for almost a year. Never again, we said after 1945. Remember Tony Judd's title, Post-War? never again. It happened again in Yugoslavia for a decade, and at the end of that decade, we said never again. And then it happened again, here in this country, in Ukraine, on the very same territory where Nazi Germany had fought a war of terror between 1941 and 1944. Putin's forces fought and are fighting a war of terror. The same cities, the same villages, sometimes the same people. Boris Romanchenko, a name some of you may know, survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, killed by a Russian missile in Kharkiv, the missile that lands near Babin Yar. Natalia Gumenyuk, a name many of you will know, a fantastic Ukrainian investigative journalist, reports, and I checked this with her the other day, that in the occupied villages around Kiev, in Bucha and Irpin and Borodyanka, where I was a few days ago, very old people referred to the Russian occupiers as Nimtsi, Germans, because for them, that's what Germans were. That's what Germans did. So we went all the way back, from post-war Europe to post-war Europe and back. Now, I said a moment ago that one shouldn't be too quick to talk about historical turning points. Nonetheless, I'm going to suggest to you that in an important sense, the 24th of February 2022 and what is happening in your country is the end both of the post-war era and in some significant sense of the post-war era. So, post-war, it's not just that it's the end of the illusions of the post-1989 period, which I talked about at the beginning, right? That we were moving towards perpetual peace, that economic interdependence would always reinforce peace, that we could dismantle our militaries and take the peace dividend, that we could become dependent on Russia for our energy and so forth. It's something more than that. It is that, in a sense, we have gone back to August 1991, right? The coup. Remember the coup in August 1991. If the coup had succeeded, then we wouldn't have had this post-war period in the same way, because we would have had the Russian Empire striking back already from that time. And it's not just me saying this, because as you know, General Sergei Surovikin, the butcher of Aleppo, the commander of the Russian forces until he was demoted, was a putschist in August 1991. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, welcome his appointment on Telegram, said, I quote, Surovikin didn't have time to get all of his ammunition into his tank in August 1991. If he had, we'd be living in a totally different country, 10 times more powerful. So you see, we come back, and it's as if the pause button was hit on history at the end of 1991, and now they've hit play again. The post-war period is slightly more complicated. If you think about the state system that we have in Europe, the political map of Europe that you all know, with all those different countries, that actually dates back to 1990, 1991 in all essentials, right? So in that sense, the post-war period, post-45, ended in 1990-91. So if you think about the international organizations, we are, in a sense, still living in the post-1945 period, the post-war period. But I think the sense in which we have come to an end of the post-war period is that we've lost the illusion that we can get to perpetual peace. We've accepted that war is again a constituent part of international relations in Europe, and that therefore we have to take military power seriously again. Now, there are a few countries in Europe that always took military power seriously. We have the Deputy French Ambassador here. France always took military power seriously. Britain always took military power seriously. But there were many countries in Europe that didn't. And so the meaning of Olaf Scholz's phrase, Zeitenwende, the watershed moment, is precisely that Germany is at least proposing, I formulate this cautiously, is at least proposing to take military power seriously again. And I don't need to tell you that if Germany takes military power seriously again, that's an important moment in European history, right? Okay. Last few minutes to bring you into the discussion, I want to just put 3 propositions on the table which are about learning lessons from history and looking to the future. People sometimes glibly say the only lesson we learn from history is that nobody ever learns history's lesson. And there's some truth in that. Nonetheless, I think it is possible to learn some lessons from history. There's a wonderful essay, which I recommend to all of you, by a great German historian called Reinhard Koselleck. I don't know if you've heard of him. Note that name, Koselleck. Superb historian. Read it. And it's called The Unknown Future and the Art of Prognosis. The Unknown Future and the Art of Predicting the Future. And he makes a very simple point that the more recurrent an event is or a phenomenon is in history, the more likely we are to be able to make a statement of probability about the future. So, for example, the statement, "we will all die," has a rather high degree of probability. In a rather large data set, I know of no case to the contrary. What happens after revolutions, for example? We have many examples. What happens to people who stay in power for too long? We have many examples, recurrent phenomena. And one of those recurrent phenomena is the trajectory of empires. That empires rise, they decline, and they fall, but they don't like falling. And so imperial powers push back. They try to resist their decline. The British, dare I say the French, the Portuguese, none of us particularly liked losing our empires. Russia even more so. And so the fundamental story of the last 30 years, no, actually of the last 50 years, is the decline and fall of the Russian Empire. And the way in which Russia is trying to resist the decline and fall of the Russian Empire. Transnistria, already 1992, General Lebed, Chechnya, South Ossetia, Abkhazia. I met Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg in 1994. He was then the deputy mayor, a sidekick of the mayor of St. Petersburg, totally unknown. Nobody knew who Vladimir Putin was. It was a Western Russian conference, and this rather unpleasant-looking little man with a slightly rat-like face, who nobody knew who he was, sat quietly at the table for 2 days saying nothing. And then he spoke up, and he said, "I want to remind you that there are territories that historically have always been Russian." I will remember that, always been Russian, which are now outside the Russian Federation. And he explicitly mentioned Crimea, 1994. And he said there are 25 million Russians outside the Russian Federation, and we have a responsibility towards them. Don't tell me that NATO enlargement was the cause of Putin's seizure of Crimea, right? NATO enlargement started happening 5 years later. This is a view which is quite popular in the West, that NATO enlargement is to blame for Putin's. The revanchist instinct, the desire to get as much as possible as the empire back, was there from the very beginning, from the early 1990s, 1994. Of course, a lot had to happen historically before it actually comes to the point where Putin is ready to act and able to act. But the basic impact, the basic instinct, we want to try and get the empire back, was there. Now, if we'd been wise and learnt this lesson from history, then when it started happening in 2008, and then even more so in 2014, we'd have said, aha, this is what is happening. The empire is striking back. And we would have had a much stronger reaction. We would have started reducing our energy dependence on Russia. We would have imposed sanctions. We would have built up our military strength, and so forth. In my view, 2014 is the turning point at which the West failed to turn, right? And in some sense, I think that's because we failed to learn this lesson of history. Second point also has to do with empires. There's a very interesting argument made by a German scholar called Gwendolyn Sasser, addressed particularly to Germany, but more broadly to the West, which is that we have to decolonize our thinking about Eastern Europe, to decolonize our thinking about Eastern Europe. Now, this is an odd version of decolonization, because if I said the British have to decolonize their thinking about India, I would be referring to our own colonies, our own former colonies, right? We are the imperial power, we have to decolonize. Or dare I say, the French have to decolonize their view of Africa, or whatever it might be, or the Portuguese of Angola. But in this case, the colonial lens is the Russian colonial lens, and Germany and other Western countries are seeing Eastern Europe through the Russian lens. So it's a rather peculiar example of decolonization. But I actually think it's really a very important, particularly, if I may say so, the decolonization of the German mind in relation to Eastern Europe, but also for other West European countries, not seeing everything in Eastern Europe through the Russian lens. To give you a quick example, Helmut Schmidt, you remember him, former Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, wrote in Die Zeit in autumn 2014 that that until 1990, no one doubted that Ukraine belonged to Russia, quote. And he went on, Ukraine is an independent state, but not a nation state. Autumn 2014, Helmut Schmidt. So there is a shared intellectual enterprise which is being conducted in the West by fine scholars like Serhii Plokhy, my former doctoral student Timothy Snyder, Anne Applebaum, Martin Schulze-Wessel in Germany, and many other fine scholars, which is actually a decolonization of the perception of Eastern Europe in the West. And I think that, one really silver lining of this war is that that progress has been absolutely catalyzed by what has happened in Ukraine, the attention that is now paid to Ukraine, the understanding that Ukraine is a proud, independent, and united European nation. But have no illusions, there's still quite a long way to go before people in the West have really decolonized their view of Eastern Europe. My final comment before throwing it open for discussion, which I look forward to, also in a curious way has to do with empire, but it's looking to the future. What are we trying to do after this war is over, after this bloody war is over? Well, first of all, we've got to help you to win it. And that means bringing more weapons faster so you can recover your territory. And actually, heroic efforts are being made in that respect. I had the huge honor and pleasure of meeting yesterday with General Zaluzhny, who was a fascinating figure, who told me in great detail what was needed, including unzipping his vest and showing me a T-shirt which said F-16. So I got the message there. But then the question becomes, what do we do then? What is actually our long-term geopolitical strategy? not just for Ukraine, but for this whole region. Before the 24th of February 2022, leading European powers were simply not prepared to accept Ukraine as a candidate for EU membership. This had been a conversation that had been going on since the Orange Revolution, if not before, and it's entirely possible that it would have gone on for many years. Chancellor Scholz made his position very clear. Western Balkans and no further. That was his position before the 24th of February. So actually, the way in which the EU has moved to accept Ukraine, Moldova, and with qualifications potentially Georgia as candidate countries is an extraordinary and rather bold step. My own view is that strategically, and this may be, it's very important to say, it may be a matter not just of years, but of decades, the geopolitical challenge is to do a second double enlargement of the West, right? So what I talked about earlier in this lecture, what happened between 1989 and 2007, was the first double enlargement of the West. Countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, and so on, came in at different times, both to NATO and the EU. Sometimes first to one, sometimes first to the other, but it was both. And in this war, NATO and the EU have got, in a sense, closer than they've ever been. At last year's Munich Security Conference, I myself saw Ursula von der Leyen and Jens Stoltenberg literally shoulder to shoulder on the stage at the Munich Security Conference. They recently had a joint declaration between the EU and NATO. So that they are, if you like, the two strong arms of the West. And longer term, strategically, the only secure future for a country like Ukraine, or indeed Moldova and Georgia, is to have membership in both organizations. How we get there, in what sequence, that all has to be discussed. But I'm thinking strategically. In order to do that, and by the way, it's quite possible that some version of NATO enlargement might actually precede EU enlargement. In order to do that, we need to interconnect, to interlink, to combine reconstruction in Ukraine, reform in Ukraine, and the process of integration into the European Union and into some sort of security relationship with the West. That seems to me the key, and to get a virtuous cycle in which your reform and reconstruction reinforces your prospects of integration into the EU, and EU integration reinforces your reconstruction and reform, which in turn reinforces your Euro-Atlantic integration. At the end of this is, to use a phrase from 1989, a Europe whole and free. If we got Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia into both those organizations, more of cultural and historical and geographical Europe would be together in one and the same political, economic, and security communities than ever before in European history. This has never been done. There has never been a union, a commonwealth, a community which actually embraces 35, 36, going on 40 European countries right across the continent in this two interlinked sense of political and economic community. So it's an extraordinary undertaking. And if we succeeded in that, we would have, for the first time ever in European history, a genuinely post-imperial Europe. That is to say, a Europe which, for the first time ever, has neither empires overseas, which we've had since the early 1400s, or empires on land, continental empires. That is what's at stake. Let me end, before throwing it open for conversation, by saying that this is going to be a long struggle. I don't think, if I may say so, your leaders are wise to start telling you you might be in the EU in 2 years. Totally unrealistic. Not going to happen. Don't kid yourselves. It's a long, slow, difficult process. And actually, it wouldn't be good for Ukraine. It wouldn't be good for Ukraine if you were not well prepared. You want to go in as a strong country into a strong union, not as a weak country into a weakened union. So it's going to be a struggle. And in this struggle, what you need is the famous combination, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, or voglio, as you might call it. Let me conclude with a quotation, a wonderful quotation from a great European leader who I was privileged to know, Václav Havel, the former Czechoslovak playwright, dissident, president of the Czech Republic. Havel wrote in the 1980s, having just come out of a communist prison, I quote, "Hope is not prognostication. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. Hope is an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. Defending, improving, and extending a free Europe, including a free Ukraine, makes sense. It's a cause worthy of hope." Thank you very much. I'm sure they can hear you.
Тепер. О, все. So thank you so much for your lecture, for this amazing account of Europeans' most recent history, created by hopes, luck, fortune, extraordinary persons, extraordinary coincidences, and still having some, I don't know, predictability if we know the lessons of history, if we can see them, read them, and make conclusions and projections. So thank you so very much. And I open floor for discussion. Actually, Professor Ґартон Еш suggested starting points for discussion, making his three points about empires, about a very important point actually about the very long and complicated process of the decolonization of West European mind regarding this region, which is still considered to be Russian space in many regards. And actually this is something I think that all of us are actually, we feel this as very, very sharply after February 24th. And we see that this is a very long and a very complicated process, but actually the events of the full-scale war they catalyze this process a lot, so we should hope it will move on, yeah? And the very last point was about the future, which is a great future for us, but it's longue durée. Yeah, it's not future we'll have in 2 days after the victory. So we shall be prepared. Okay, so these were these points that made by Professor Ґартон Еш, and you are welcome to share your thoughts about these points, or maybe you have some other questions inspired by the lecture or inspired by his writings. So please raise your hands. Okay, we've got many questions. So let's start. I would ask everyone to introduce himself, and then ask the question or share your thoughts. Yes, please.
Okay, so I've always thought of empires as...
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm so sorry. I'm just kind of nervous. I'm Tanya. I study in Kyiv-Mogilянській Academy on Germanic philology and literature. So I've always thought of empires as of dying stars, because when the star is about to explode, it expands and destroys everything on their way. So can we say that the war in Ukraine can be considered to be the last breath for Russia? Or we have so much more to expect in future decades for Russia as a country with empire, connotation to it. Thank you.
What a great question. Thank you very much. We thought the Ottoman Empire was over and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were over in around at the end of the First World War, 1918, 1920. And it turned out in the 1990s that it wasn't true. Yeah? 80 years later, we were still dealing with the last succession issues from the Ottoman and to some extent Austro-Hungarian empires in the Balkans in southeastern Europe. So these processes take a very long time. And I'm afraid that's quite likely to be true of the decline and fall of the Russian Empire. For a number of reasons. Firstly, because the Russian Federation itself is a kind of internal empire, right? So it has its own multiple peoples, so there's a whole story to unfold there. Secondly, because Russia doesn't have a state identity, a clear state identity to go back to. So if you think about the British Empire, which was mainly an overseas empire, and then it went, but England was a united state with a parliament, with a privy council, with a monarchy, with independent courts in the Middle Ages. So the English had something to go back to. So the process of decolonization was easier for the colonial power, both because it was overseas, so it was somewhere else, but also because we had something else to go back to. All the Russians have is Muscovy, right? And so it's much more difficult in that aspect. And thirdly, because this is the first example of a declining empire that has nuclear weapons, right? Haven't had that before. And that makes it even more challenging. So I think we're going to be wrestling with the decline of the Russian Empire for a very long time to come. There is a limit to how far we can affect it directly, right? We only have secondary impact on it. The best thing we can do is to secure the external environment through the double enlargement of the West, and then simply the processes will have to work themselves out inside Russia in whatever way they work out and however long they take. But it'll be quite a few years of your lifetime.
Thanks. Yeah, please.
Do you need to try something here? Yeah. No, just try. Just try, yeah. So Yeah, hello. I'm extremely thankful for your speech. I'm Gleb Ostapenko, the political scientist, the third year. I'm a student, of course, of Kyiv-Mogilянській Academy. So it is important for me just to know what do you think about Nigel Farage, his European Parliament speeches nearly in 2015, nearly in 2016, his role in British Brexit, and what do you think how Britain can find its real, true role inside Europe, maybe just politically, maybe diplomatically, maybe economically, maybe, of course, in world, how the post-Brexit Britain can find its own way, just also with values, of course. It is important, and maybe in Eastern Europe, maybe in another part of the world. And the last one, what do you think about the House of Lords? Is it important for the Westminster to have this institution? Because we know that there was a lot of debate there about this institution. So just what do you think about those three questions? Thank you.
So let me knock two of them off quite quickly. I think very little of Nigel Farage. A populist demagogue whose source of income is his pension from the European Parliament. And the House of Lords, it seems to me, a total anachronism in a democracy. There are circumstances in which you could make the case for an appointed upper house. There are circumstances, or a partially appointed upper house. But the way in which lords are made is completely indefensible. So I think it should be abolished and turned into a democratic upper house. To your larger question, I think that Brexit is by far the largest mistake my country has made since the era of appeasement in the 1930s. And we're going to be paying for that mistake for many years to come, because what now faces us is a very long, slow, difficult road, some of the way back. I hope eventually all of the way back, but initially some of the way back, gradually improving our relations area by area, starting with the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Horizon research schemes, Erasmus, economic relations. At some point, probably towards the end of this decade, thinking about single market or customs union, and then maybe at some point thinking of rejoining. Maybe Ukraine and UK will join together. Wouldn't that be nice? But it's going to be, it was such an act of folly. Decided, by the way, by just 650,000 votes. I mean, it's another example of historical luck, but going the wrong way. And it's put us in a very bad place. What I am proud of, there's very little one can be proud of in British politics since 2016, but I'm really proud of our support for Ukraine. Because, there was a cynical version of Brexit, which said, we were getting out of Europe. It's nothing to do with us. Let them fight it out over there in Eastern Europe. But no, the absolutely instinctive reaction of the Brits was, here's a country fighting for its freedom, we've got to get in there. That's a good fight. And that's something I'm proud of.
My name is Solomia. Thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. I'm a student of law, actually, fourth year. I wanted to ask you two small questions. First one, in connection with the first speaker. Do you believe that this war will have its consequence in the war in Russia itself, maybe between some parts of federation? And my second question is, last year, half of the year I've spent in the UK, and actually I talked to many people, and I needed to explain a lot of things to them about Ukraine, because obviously, as you said, the view of Ukraine was very from the Russian point of view. What do you think we can do to change that and to help world see Ukraine through Ukrainian view? Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's very interesting, because almost every time I speak to a Ukrainian audience, this question of the disintegration of the Russian Federation comes up. It's clearly something you think about a lot, right? Yeah. possibly wishful thinking. Look, Putin has a very strong dictatorship. Yeah, he's at the moment got it under control. And so I wouldn't have many illusions that that's going to be the decisive factor. My hunch is that if the change comes, it will come not from popular rising, not from the disintegration of the Russian Federation, but through some process among the elites who finally decide they have to change course. And nobody can tell you exactly how or when that will come. But that's my best guess, and it's only a guess. To your great question on Britain, it's not, actually Britain on the whole doesn't see, Britain has a very hostile relationship with Russia now for many years. I mean, it's among the Western powers. It has one of the most tense relationships with Russia, partly because of a series of incidents, including the poisoning of British citizens on British soil by Russia. But it's just that people are ignorant, and they just think it's a long way away, and they don't quite know where Russia ends and Ukraine begins. I think the last year has changed a hell of a lot of that already, partly because so many people have Ukrainian refugees, so they actually have an individual human being who they know is a Ukrainian. But if we're going to change it long term, we have to change education, right? Because at the moment it's called Russian and East European Studies, and it's subordinated to Russia. So actually we have an event in Oxford next month, to which your foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba, is coming, which is intended to build up Ukrainian studies in the UK. So if you know an old-fashioned and highly respectable billionaire who'd like to support Ukrainian studies at Oxford, that would be a good initiative. Unfortunately, it was Mr. Akhmetov who supported them at Cambridge, which wasn't so good.
Good afternoon, my name is Luba, and I'm third year student of the humanitarian faculty. And during your lecture, you mentioned about the phrase "never again," but it gave me a thought that since Second World War ended, it built a chain of events that led to the Georgian War in 2008 and the current Russian invasion that began last year. So, in my opinion, do you think that the Second World War is a reflection of the current of the war that happened in 90s and today, or it is somehow transferred, came back in our time as the Russian-Ukrainian war? Or it is some sort of, or if it is an initiation that Ukraine must pass to enter NATO and the European Union.
So I didn't totally, did you get, I didn't quite get the question there.
I mean that...
it's right, the acoustic is rather bad, I'm afraid.
I mean, is it this Ukrainian-Russian war, is it an initiation that Ukraine must pass, or it is defense of freedom and other values that you mentioned during your elections, and also not only Ukrainians, but also Europeans? And how Second World War had a great influence over the Europe, including Ukraine.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I had difficulty hearing it acoustically. I mean, the answer is very simple. Yes, absolutely. I think it's in many ways very comparable, and of course it's a war for values, and indeed I think one reason people respond to it so strongly is it's a reminder of the importance of certain values which perhaps had been somewhat neglected or forgotten in the West. Freedom, courage, you know, the famous funeral oration of Pericles in Thucydides' history. The secret of happiness is liberty, and the secret of liberty is courage. So I think this very, very, as it were, these lessons that are at the heart of Western civilization, we've been reminded of them, and people respond very strongly to that. We've just done some polling. My research project at Oxford University has just done some polling with the European Council on Foreign Relations about attitudes to the war in Ukraine. And what's interesting is that whereas Americans tend to see it as a war for democracy, because that's the framing very much in the United States, Europeans see it particularly as a war for European security. So it's not just the values side of it, it's also that we see it as being about our own security longer term. And perhaps in that sense too, it's comparable with the Second World War.
Well, thank you, Professor, for this fascinating lecture. I'm Benjamin Oig, I'm the Deputy French Ambassador. I would like to know if you can elaborate a bit more on the enlargement, because I think all the period of enlargement has been, there was, with enlargement, one big main idea with the construction of the EU. Let's say in the 80s, so it was, you mentioned it, the common market. In the 19s, I would say that would be the cohesion policy. In 2000, euros. 2010, we had no enlargement. Well, we had Brexit. What could be the main idea that could go with this new enlargement from Ukraine, for Georgia, and maybe Moldova, and maybe the Balkans? What could be this idea that could help European Union to integrate these new countries, as you mentioned in your lecture?
Thank you very much. It actually connects very much to the last question, because I think you might start with European security, geopolitical Europe, the notion of Europe as a power, l'Europe puissance, a geopolitical understanding, because obviously the case for this enlargement is very much a geostrategic case. So I think at least for the elites, at the elite level, and perhaps for part of public opinion, that's a narrative which is quite helpful. Thinking not just about Russia, but thinking about China, thinking about other emerging powers. So that's point number one. Point number two, though, is that every widening requires a deepening. And actually, Scholz, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, having been very reluctant to endorse enlargement, as you and I have discussed, then in a speech in Prague at the end of August, is actually the first European leader, in my view, really to spell out what it would require to make a European Union of 35 member states continue to function as an effective community, and that is more qualified majority voting on many significant issues, starting with sanctions and foreign policy, so that, for example, Viktor Orban can't simply threaten to veto the next round of sanctions on Russia unless the European Union gives him another 5.8 billion euros, which is actually what happened. In order to release 18 billion euros for Ukraine this year, the EU had to agree to give 5.8 billion euros to Viktor Orban. So that I think there's also a story to be told about the strengthening, the deepening of the European Union, which is made necessary by that widening. Whether all the European publics of member states are actually up for that is another question.
Thanks. So, any other questions, please?
You have a question?
Yeah.
So, as I understood, just like Russia, China wants to take the Taiwan for itself?
So I didn't hear that.
I mean, just like Russia, China wants to occupy Taiwan.
Oh, yes. Got it.
But I don't think that's possible, Professor, because Taiwan might give the same strong resistance as Ukraine gives to those Russians.
So, I think another reason why the United States in particular, but also Western powers more broadly, are so committed to helping Ukraine is the precedent that would otherwise be set for China to go after Taiwan. And most analysts think it is probable that China, Xi Jinping, is going to make a go to get Taiwan one way or another within this decade. That's what most analysts say. So it has a big knock-on effect in terms of whether Putin is seen to succeed or not. That's point number one. Point number two, Taiwan is rethinking its own defense in the light of the story of what's happening in Ukraine and trying to turn itself into a hedgehog. So it's actually learning from Ukraine in terms of civilian defense and so on, lots of small-scale initiatives rather than sort of big weapon systems. So I think it's having quite a big global impact, and I think Xi Jinping is watching very closely indeed. Sorry. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Ostap Krivdik, Ukrainian Strategic Initiative, Kyiv-Mogila affiliated think tank. Sir, you said that there were times post-war and there were times post-wall, and the walls are being built and the war is ongoing. Shall we dream on of the next time when the walls will be put down? What preconditions should there be for the future walls between Lithuania and Belarus and Poland and Belarus and probably between Ukraine and Russia fall in the future, or over post-Russia countries which would emerge on that vast sphere? Do you see the time, the next cycle of the post-wall or not? Thank you.
You know, that's a terrific question. That's a terrific question. I have, one of the last chapters in my book is called The New Iron Curtain. And the New Iron Curtain is not through the middle of Europe, it's around the edge of Europe. And I went to a place called Ceuta, which is a tiny, tiny, now Spanish bit of Spain, which is the only bit of Europe which is actually on the African continent. It's on the other side of the Mediterranean. And went and looked at the wall. It's actually a fence, which is a 6-meter high fence, and then a sand strip, and then another fence, and barbed wire, and sensors, and dogs, and military riding up and down it. And it looks exactly like the Iron Curtain through the middle of Europe. And so we've taken down the walls in the middle of Europe, and we're building them around the edge of Europe. And to be quite honest with you, I don't see them coming down anytime soon, because with the growth of world population and inequality between North and South in the world, the pressure from the poor people in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the wider Middle East to come towards the Promised Land, to try and migrate towards Europe, is, and not to mention the impact of climate change, is only going to increase. So that I don't think we're going to take the walls down around the edge of Europe or the Schengen area. The question is whether we can make it a humane relationship with legal channels of migration into the European Union or into a country like Britain, or whether it will just get ever more brutal until in the end it really is like the Berlin Wall and you have a death strip around the edge of Europe. And I think that's truly one of the great challenges of our time.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Alexander Demenchuk, I'm Dean of Social Sciences. And first of all, I thank you for so interesting topic, so interesting lecture, and I'm wondering, could it be more young people taking into account that, well, we have in the middle of the war, and many our students are abroad or in other cities. Nevertheless, these young people are so interested in the topic. And one of the features, because I teach also to them, one of the interesting features of this youth is that most of them want to know the future. And, you know, just yesterday I took part in one seminar at the Ministry of Education, and one person said that history is for explaining the past, but not for predicting the future. Do you agree with this sentence? And is it possible to expect that history could show us, or at least make some hit for the future, for understanding what can be reached, what can be realized in the future, proceeding from the past? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you know, when Americans say that's history, they mean it's irrelevant. Forget it. Don't worry about it. When people in Eastern Europe say that's history, they mean it's the most important thing. So sure, history matters. The desire, I have a chapter in my book about the oracle at Delphi, right? So people used to make long journeys, difficult journeys to the oracle at Delphi to ask the oracle about the future. And the yearning to know what's going to happen next has never died. All the way from the oracle at Delphi and people reading tea leaves, or, you know, astrology, in which, by the way, a lot of Europeans believe, to big corporations who pay enormous sums of money for people to try and predict the future. So we don't know the future. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in 10 years' time. But what we can do with the help of history is to make probabilistic statements. We can identify probable patterns, probable courses of development. As I said, like what happens in the decline of empires, or what happens with people who have too much power for too long. And that is, I think, the way in which history can be helpful in shaping a sense of how things tend to happen and how they tend not to happen. Not specifically it's going to happen there or then. The other thing, if I may, and perhaps I could finish on this, is, of course, there's nothing that compares with personal experience. So if you look at the history of Europe in the last 80 years, there have been a series of key political generations. I call them the 14ers, who are the people who experienced the First World War as young people, Charles de Gaulle, Konrad Adenauer, Winston Churchill. These are people who actually shaped our continent well into the mid-20th century. The 39ers, probably some of your grandparents, my father, the people who fought or experienced at firsthand the Second World War. Then there's a pause. Then you have the 68ers. You probably have a few of them here. 68, the 68ers. And then there's a pause, and then you have the 89ers. And the 89ers, I mentioned a few, Tim Snyder, Anne Applebaum, Ivan Krastev. These are people who were young. Karl Mannheim, the sociologist, says, you know, formative experiences are normally between the ages of 17 and 25. Ballpark. How many of you? Probably most of you, yes? Formative experience, 1989. For the rest of your life, you're in the spirit of 1989. And here's an interesting question to you. Maybe you're going to be the 22ers right? There aren't many generations who have such a massive experience as a big war of national self-defense and liberation. And so, in a way, I hope that you're going to become the 22ers and going to give a new impulse to a Europe of freedom and democracy and peace and prosperity, because you have this formative experience. So I look forward to seeing you all in 20 years' time and seeing what the 22ers have done.
Great, yeah, please. So we have some 10 minutes. Okay.
Professor Еш, thank you very much for your lecture and such an in-depth look in European history. I'm Vladislava Osmak. I'm a director of Culture and Arts Center, where we're having you as a guest now. To me, the war that Russia started against Ukraine was inevitable since 2010. I remember the day when the agreement about prolongation of Russian fleet presence in Crimea was signed, and I said to my friends, there will be blood. I don't know whether it's worth to discuss now when the war is going, whether it was possible or not to prevent it. But my question is, I was always looking at European Union on two aspects, rules and strong public society. We're moving in that direction. From inside, from Ukraine, I can see, I can feel I am part of that. The public society is growing. But some years ago, even in 2014, what was the reason that Europe didn't stand for Ukraine as it does now? Was it because it was not seen as a subject of international European policy yet? Or because there was no strong public society in Ukraine developed? Or whether it was, we still had no institutions as instrument? And whether public society institutions may prevent losing Ukrainian identity. When the war is over, we don't know what will be left from our country. Sometimes in our media there is an information that country N said they will restore region Y, and city X said they will rebuild a town A. I don't see Ukraine there. It's like government said, we will give you. Sometimes I think, oh my God, this will be a new colonization, not from the East, but from the West. I think that your public society institutions may help us to hold and to develop our identity. What is your point of view on these perspectives of integration, subject of Ukraine within European policy, and public society is an instrument of developing of strong European democracy? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I sort of feel there are maybe 2 points in there. I mean, one is quickly, I really hope Angela Merkel gets a good historian to work with her on her memoirs. Because your question about what we got wrong and why we got it wrong does need to be addressed. And my hunch is the answer, in an odd way, doesn't have much to do with Ukraine, right? Although it was, we got it wrong about Ukraine, but I'm not sure it has all that much to do with Ukraine as such, because I think it was multiple other factors, including failing to learn the lessons of history, misreading Russia, hoping it would go away, and something Merkel said in a recent interview, you've got to remember there were all these other problems, right? So it came at this moment when there was the perfect storm, and there was a Eurozone, which was much more existential for many leading European states. So it's interesting to ask the question, but I think the explanations will not point to major, as it were, absences on the Ukrainian side. Now, on your second point, which is what now or what next, This seems to me absolutely crucial, and this is really for everybody in this room. I think there's going to be, first we've got to win this war. But I think, pray God, we win this war, and soon there's going to be a really critical moment, which is immediately after the war. And there's a real danger at that moment that everybody sags down, back, relaxes, exhausted. People in this country go back to their private lives, many of them outside or go and find work elsewhere, maybe go back into bad old ways inside the country. And the European Union starts looking elsewhere. And we have a really worrying example, which is what happened in the Western Balkans. North Macedonia became a candidate for membership of the European Union in 2005. We're now 2023, right? And so I think demonstrating that Ukraine really has the volia, the national will, to go on transforming its institutions in peacetime and to become a credible member state of the European Union is going to be really important, particularly in that first year or two, because otherwise we could go into a downward spiral, because there are lots of people waiting in the rest of Europe to say, oh, we told you so, Ukraine isn't serious, it's so corrupt, the oligarchs are back, etc. All these negative narratives could come back quite quickly unless you shape, so you brilliantly shape the narrative in wartime, now you'll have to shape the narrative in the first years of peace.
Thanks so much. If I may have one last question myself.
So I plan to have mine, but okay.
Okay, then yours and mine. Okay, yeah, please.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. So my name is Larisa Chevnyuk. I'm head of international office at Kyiv-Mogilянській Academy, and my question is about university. So we are at the university, yes, so it's a very strange university, meaning that university is running, so what narratives should be brought here? And vice versa, as a Ukrainian university, we definitely want to change that narratives, Russian perspectives on the Eastern Europe, but also that impact of what we are surviving would be understood and would be somehow transmitted to the students in different disciplines. So I would not ask what other universities should do so that this war would be translated into the courses, into the study programs, but maybe what we could do as Ukrainian intellectuals so that, again, so our situation was somehow be understood in different subject areas and so analyzed from different perspectives. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I sort of hesitate to give advice to other universities, but maybe two thoughts. You know the English word benchmarking, which is looking around Europe or wherever and trying to find the best practice and then benchmark yourself against it. So industries can benchmark or governments can benchmark. And I think it's good for all of us in universities to do benchmarking, to go looking around Europe and seeing the best practices and then to benchmark oneself against it, and in terms of sort of the techniques one uses and what one gives students. So maybe one thing you could do, you've probably done it already, because I know many of your students have experiences at other European universities in the meantime. And it'd be quite interesting just to sit down and have a conversation, maybe an anonymous survey, and find out, you know, what they thought was really good in these different places. I think we could all benefit from that. That's point number one. Point number two, I think part of the challenge of that post-war moment, which we were just talking about, and the slightly dangerous moment, you've had a heroic narrative of Ukraine, but it's been Ukraine at war against Russia. So in a sense, Ukraine has been defined as the not Russia, right? That's standing up to Russia, fighting against Russia, defending against Russia, being better than Russia. The challenge would be to say what Ukraine is actually for as much as what it's against, and to develop those positive narratives about distinctive features of Ukrainian society that people might find interesting elsewhere. And I think in that respect, maybe the university would have a role to play, both nationally and internationally.
Thank you. So is it working? Okay. So if I may, so being a historian, I can't, but I should be back to your question, your thesis about history lessons and the question raised by Professor Demenchuk, what history teaches. And I remember a lovely discussion some 2 years ago, it's, if I'm not mistaken, with Professor Sergei Plokhy, whom you mentioned, about his most recent book in Ukrainian, and the book is called Magistra Vitae, so history as a Magistra Vitae. So I just wanted to make this point, but this sparkled a question that I would like to raise, and this in a kind of continuation of what Larissa just said. In this book, Magistra Vitae, Professor Plokhy also raises the issue of the public role of intellectuals, so of historians, other intellectuals. And being back to your point on West Ukrainian mind that needs to be decolonized regarding the Eastern European region. So what do you think we here as Ukrainian intellectuals can do to somehow, I don't know, catalyze this process, to assist in this process of decolonization of West European mind regarding the East European region, including Ukraine? Thank you. What can we do?
Write good books. Like Professor Plokhy, I would say. I think that, again, there's this kind of, this moment of opportunity. So when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, every Western publisher had to have their Czech or Slovak book. When martial law was declared in Poland, every publisher had to have their Polish book. Bosnia, everyone had to have the book. Now, everybody wants their Ukrainian book. So it's this moment of opportunity where if you've got something to say, there is actually a market out there to say it, but that market may not be there in 2 years' time. So I actually think, Ukraine is now moving very fast, and I think in this respect, actually, one thing you have to do is to move fast to seize this moment. The other thing I would want to say is, and this goes broader than the decolonization point, we have a pandemic. We had a COVID pandemic. Now we have a pandemic of politics based on bad history. So Putin is an obvious example of murderous politics based on bad history. So instead of trying to inform your politics by a vision of the future, your politics are informed by a vision of the past that never existed, right? But it's not just Putin. Modi, Narendra Modi in India, has something very similar. Xi Jinping, in a way, has something very similar in China. So I think more broadly, there's a real mission for historians, and we have to watch out, because there would be a temptation in this context for, I could imagine, for Ukrainian historians to contribute to a sort of myth building, right? To a certain comforting view of the heroic history of Ukraine without looking at the more complicated or darker sides. So I think that historians have to stick to the ethics of their own profession and destroy the myth. We need to be myth destroyers, not myth makers, and you're actually doing a greater service by being the myth destroyer than by being the myth the myth maker. So I think there's a quite specific task for historians there, you know, in that way we contribute as much to the future as anybody else does.
Thank you so much.